All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into this mountain of research you sent over, all about IND applications.
Oh, yeah.
That critical step that takes a new drug from the lab to actual patients. And I think it's really fascinating how a company has to prove their drug is safe and effective enough to even think about human trials.
Yeah, it really is a high-stakes process.
It is.
You're essentially building a case to convince the FDA that your drug deserves a chance to actually become a treatment.
Right, and that's what we're focusing on today, these IND-enabling studies, the research that a company needs to do before they can even consider giving their drug to a human volunteer.
Yeah, it's like laying the foundation. You wouldn't build a skyscraper without making sure that the base is totally solid, and the same principle applies here.
So what are the key parts of this foundation? What kind of studies are we talking about?
Well, there are three main pillars: toxicology studies to make sure the drug is safe, for pharmacokinetics or PK, to understand how the drug moves through the body, and efficacy studies to show that it actually works.
Okay, let's start with toxicology. I mean, that's got to be priority number one, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Making sure the drug isn't going to cause any
You
harm.
got it. Toxicology studies are all about assessing risk. Researchers expose animals to different doses of the drug, and they meticulously track any adverse effects, everything from mild reactions to serious organ damage.
Oh, wow. So they're not just looking to see if the drug is, immediately lethal or something. They're trying to find subtle long-term effects as well.
Exactly. They're looking at the drug's impact on specific organs, liver, kidneys, heart, you name it. They're also studying how the drug behaves over time. Does it accumulate in the body? Does it break down into harmful byproducts? It's an incredibly thorough process.
That is good to know. So all of this is happening before the drug is anywhere near a person. That's pretty reassuring.
It is, and this very meticulous approach is driven by strict regulatory guidelines that are set by organizations like the FDA and the International Council for Harmonization, or ICH.
Okay, so there's a whole rule book for how these toxicology studies need to be conducted.
These guidelines ensure that the data is reliable and the studies are ethically sound. For example, they might say which animal species are most appropriate for a certain study, or how long those animals need to be monitored after they've received the drug.
I see. So it sounds like they are trying to eliminate as much variability as possible and potential for error. It's like building a scientific fortress around the data.
That's a great way to put it. And that same level of rigor applies to the other two pillars, PK and efficacy.
Okay, well, let's talk about PK then. I think that's the one that always seems a bit mysterious to me, how a drug moves through the body.
It's basically a roadmap. PK studies track a drug's journey from the moment it enters the body to its elimination, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, ADME as it's often called.
ADME, okay, got it. So they're looking at how the drug is absorbed into the bloodstream, where it travels in the body, how it's broken down, and how it's eventually excreted. But why is that all so important?
Well, understanding a drug's PK is absolutely crucial for figuring out the right dose and dosing schedule for humans. You need to make sure that the drug reaches its target effectively, but without causing any toxicity. So let's say you have a drug that's rapidly metabolized by the liver. You might need to give it more frequently or in a higher dose to make sure there's enough in the body to be effective.
That makes sense. So it's not just knowing how the drug moves. It's using that information to really optimize how it's used in people. It's like fine-tuning a machine.
Yeah, precisely. And PK studies can also uncover some really interesting insights about potential side effects. For example, a drug that can easily cross what's called the blood-brain barrier might be more likely to cause neurological side effects.
Wow. So just by studying how a drug moves through the body, you can start to predict how it might behave in humans, both the good and the bad.
Exactly. And that's just one piece of the puzzle. We still need to look at efficacy. Does the drug actually do what it's supposed to do?
Right, because a drug could be safe and, have a perfect journey through the body. But if it doesn't actually work, what's the point? So how do researchers even tackle that question in this preclinical stage?
Well, that's where efficacy studies come in. And they are designed to provide evidence that the drug is effective at treating the condition it's meant for. And this is where things get really interesting, because researchers need to create a model that actually mimics the human disease that they're targeting.
So if you're developing a drug for, say, Alzheimer's disease, you wouldn't just test it on any mouse.
Yeah.
You need a mouse that, exhibits some of the same hallmarks of Alzheimer's.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning. The study design itself has to be incredibly rigorous. You need to have a large enough sample size, appropriate controls, and clear endpoints that can be objectively measured.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of pressure to get these efficacy studies, right? Because after all, they are the proof of concept, right?
Right.
The data that shows that this drug might actually work in humans.
Absolutely. And that's where those regulatory guidelines we talked about earlier come back into play. The FDA and ICH, they have very specific requirements for how these efficacy studies are conducted, and the data that they generate has to be really, really solid.
Okay, so let's say a company has completed all three types of studies, toxicology, PK, and efficacy, and the data looks promising. What happens next?
Then they compile all of their findings into a huge dossier called an IND application, and it's their formal request to the FDA to begin human clinical trials.
So it's more than just presenting the data.
Yeah.
They're essentially making a case to the FDA, arguing that their drug, is worthy of moving on to becoming an actual treatment for people.
Exactly. They need to really demonstrate that they have a deep understanding of the drug's safety profile, its journey through the body, and its potential effectiveness, and they have to do it in a way that's clear, concise, and scientifically rigorous. Remember, the FDA's #1 responsibility is to protect public health.
Right, so the FDA reviewers are kind of like scientific detectives. They're scrutinizing every single detail of the IND application.
That's a great way to think about it. They're looking for any red flags, any gaps in the data, inconsistencies in the study, designs, any concerns about potential risks to those human volunteers.
So even if a company has followed all the guidelines and, the data looks good on the surface, there's still a chance that the FDA could say no.
Absolutely. The IND review process is so thorough, and the FDA will not hesitate to request more studies or clarification if they have any concerns at all.
Wow, it's really hitting home how much goes into this process. And we've only been talking about the preclinical stage. I can only imagine how much more complex it gets when you start testing the drug in humans.
Oh, yeah, it definitely gets more complex, but the preclinical stage is so critical. It's the foundation that the entire drug development process is built on.
So we've got these three pillars, toxicology, PK, and efficacy, all meticulously designed and conducted, according to all these strict regulatory guidelines. But it's not just about checking boxes, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned this overarching idea of data integration earlier.
The FDA doesn't just want to see 3 separate reports. They want to see how the data from all 3 studies fit together. How does the drug's safety profile align with its PK properties? Does the proposed dose and dosing schedule make sense given the drug's behavior in the body and its observed effectiveness in the animal models?
It's like putting together a puzzle. Each study provides a piece, and only when you put all the pieces together can you see the complete picture.
Exactly. And that whole picture, that integrated understanding of the drug is what allows the FDA to make a well-informed decision about whether or not to allow the drug to move on to human trials.
I'm realizing that there's so much more to drug development than just, discovering a new molecule.
Yeah.
It's this incredible journey of scientific rigor, regulatory oversight, and ultimately, the hope of bringing a new treatment to people who really need it.
It really is. And while the preclinical stage may seem like just the first step, it's arguably one of the most critical. It's the stage where those researchers lay the foundation for a drug success and where they try to answer that most important question, is this drug safe and effective enough to actually test in humans?
What I find so fascinating is that we've been talking about this from a very scientific, data-driven perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this human element to it too, isn't there?
Absolutely. Behind every single IND application, there's a team of incredibly dedicated researchers who are driven by the desire to make a difference in people's lives. And behind every potential new treatment, there are patients waiting and hoping for a breakthrough.
Okay, so we've covered those 3 key study types, the regulatory landscape and the importance of data integration. What else should we be considering as we try to really wrap our heads around this whole IND application process?
Well, one thing that is often overlooked is the huge amount of collaboration that's involved.
Collaboration in what way?
Well, you've got toxicologists, pharmacologists, efficacy experts, statisticians, regulatory specialists, all of these different disciplines coming together to contribute their expertise.
It's like an orchestra with each section playing its part to create, a harmonious whole.
Yeah.
And the conductor in this case is
The project leader, they're the one who's responsible for coordinating all the moving parts, making sure that the studies are conducted according to the plan and that all of the data is meticulously analyzed and integrated.
So it's not just about scientific brilliance, it's also about project management, communication, and teamwork.
Exactly, and that's something that people don't always fully appreciate. It really takes a village to bring a new drug to market, and the preclinical stage is where that village comes together.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. We've gone from thinking about these individual studies to seeing the IND application process as this intricate web of scientific disciplines and regulatory guidelines and collaborative effort. It's amazing to see how much work goes into building a case for a new drug before it even reaches a human volunteer.
It really is remarkable. And remember, we've really only just scratched the surface here. There's a whole world of fascinating details within each of these study types, and we could easily spend hours unpacking them all.
Well, I am definitely intrigued. What stands out to you as particularly fascinating within, y- this world of preclinical research? Perhaps something that our listener would find particularly interesting.
One of the things that I always find so fascinating is how researchers actually figure out the right dose for a new drug. It's a lot more complicated than just picking a number at random.
Yeah. How do they determine that? What goes into it?
Well, you start with those toxicology studies. They give us the drug's safety margin, that range of doses that are likely to be safe for people. But, it's not just about avoiding toxic effects. You also have to think about the drug's PK properties. How fast is it absorbed? How long does it hang around in the body? How is it metabolized?
Oh, right. So the PK data helps refine the dosing schedule, like how often someone would need to take the drug to keep enough of it in their system.
You got it, but it doesn't stop there. You also need to consider efficacy, what dose is needed to actually have the desired effect. And that's where the animal studies are so important.
I see it's all coming together now. You're essentially taking information from all three study types, toxicology, PK, and efficacy, and using that to come up with a dosing strategy that works the best and minimizes risk.
That's it, precisely. It's a complex puzzle, but it's a puzzle that researchers are getting better and better at solving. And, that's really good news for patients because it means that new drugs are more likely to be both safe and effective when they finally do make it to market.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the three pillars of preclinical research, toxicology, PK, and efficacy. And we've seen how these studies are shaped by strict regulatory guidelines and this spirit of collaboration. We also touched on data integration, putting all those pieces of the puzzle together to get a complete picture of the drug. It's clear that the IND application process is a complex and really challenging thing, but it's also super exciting.
Yeah.
It's the gateway to bringing new treatments to people who are waiting and hoping for relief.
It really is. And remember, this is just a small glimpse into the world of drug development. There's a whole universe of information out there, and I would really encourage you to keep exploring.
Oh, I definitely will. And to our listener, I hope this deep dive has piqued your curiosity too. The journey of a new drug from the lab to the pharmacy is a long and winding one, but it's filled with scientific breakthroughs and collaborative spirit and ultimately the promise of improving human health.
Well said. Keep asking those questions, keep learning, and don't ever underestimate the power of scientific discovery.
Until next time, stay curious.